All right, good afternoon. Thanks so much to everyone for joining us today for this terrific conversation about the Black student debt crisis. This is the latest conversation in the Hunt Institute's Post-Secondary Pathways series, and we so appreciate you all tuning in today. I'm James Michalowski, a senior policy analyst with the Hunt Institute. I'm going to say a couple of extremely brief housekeeping notes before turning things over to our president and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui. I want to let you all know that we've reserved plenty of time for Q&A in this webinar, and we ask that you submit questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please note that we are not going to be unmuting lines, so we ask that you use that Q&A feature. Please also feel free to follow along with the conversation on social media. You can follow along on Twitter using the hashtag postpathways. Please feel free to submit questions via Twitter. And please note that we are also broadcasting live on Facebook in case you know of anyone who would prefer to tune in that way. So without further ado, I will now turn things over to the Hunt Institute's president and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, who's going to kick things off with some opening remarks. Over to you, Javed.
Thanks, James. We appreciate all of you joining us for this latest installment of our Post-Secondary Pathways webinar series. Today, we're going to focus on the unique challenges faced by Black students who borrow money to attend higher education and about the importance of crafting policy solutions that support Black student borrowers in very specific ways. You can't have this conversation about Black student loan debt without placing it in a larger context of discriminatory public policy that has disadvantaged generations of Black families. And I know that our speakers today are ready to have this conversation. This topic has also taken a new significance because of the pandemic. COVID-19 has disproportionately affected Black communities. Many Black student borrowers may face additional barriers to completion, such as increased healthcare costs or unexpected childcare duties. Due to the pandemic, these borrowers are not able to earn a degree. They are further disadvantaged in a labor market that already discriminates against them and less likely to be able to pay off any student loan debt that they may have accumulated through their time in post-secondary. I'm looking forward to hearing ideas about these policies and from policymakers, how we can support Black student borrowers from these experts on our panel. So I'm excited to be joined by our friend, Dr. Tiffany Jones from the Education Trust, Dr. Dominique Baker from SMU, Ben Miller from the Center for American Progress, and moderating our discussion today is Ashley Harrington from the Center for Responsible Lending. With that, I'll turn it over to Ashley to get our conversation going. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you, Hunt Institute, for hosting this important webinar. Most of us on this panel, all of us on this panel know each other pretty well, and we've all talked extensively and been in many conversations about the Black student debt crisis. And I think it's really fitting that the Hunt Institute is taking extra steps to put it in the larger context of how we got here and why the Black student debt crisis is so concerning and why it even exists. I think Dr. Siddiqui mentioned at the very beginning that there's been a history of predatory exclusion in this country, and exclusion of Black people and other people of color. There's always been, since 1619, when Black people were forcibly brought here, since Jim Crow, since redlining, since all of these pieces, there's always been this dual system of access and opportunity in this country, whereby Black people have been really relegated outside of the mainstream, and that extends to financial institutions and financial well-being. So they've really been we've been prevented from building wealth in so many ways, and that's through government-sponsored and supported policies and practices at every level that we have seen this. So it's important to remember that when we're thinking about the fact that Black people are more likely to have subprime loans, to be exposed to only get credit through payday lenders, to have to pay more for credit at every turn, from when they buy a car and having higher interest rates for cars, to the fact that the credit scoring model itself falsely equates race with risk. And that means that Black people are always paying more for credit. And it's just very expensive to be a Black person and Black family in this country. And the student debt crisis is a direct result of that. And so when we talk about the Black student debt crisis, we have to remember that it's both the product of the racial wealth gap, but it's also exacerbating that racial wealth gap. When we think about the labor market discrimination that Black people face, that you know, every one of us has heard last hired, first fired. When we think about that, the fact that communities of color, Black communities in particular, have yet to recover from the Great Recession, where they lost over $1 trillion in wealth that has not been returned. It is no wonder then, as we watch these policies and practices compound on each other because they've never been addressed, that we're now in a place where we're saying there is a student debt crisis for everyone, but it's much worse for Black borrowers who have to borrow and borrow more and are struggling more in repayment because we have never addressed the systemic inequities that plague every single part of our system. So I'm really excited to be here, and I will jump right in with Dr. Tiffany Jones. She is the Senior Director of Higher Education Policy at the Education Trust, and I will let her do her opening remarks.
Yep. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm excited for the conversation today, especially hearing from the other panelists as well, and excited that the Hunt Institute is having this conversation. I work for the Education Trust. We're a nonprofit policy and advocacy organization that focuses on early education all the way through higher ed, but specifically on opportunities and outcomes for students from low-income families and students of color, including Black students. And just a couple of thoughts as it relates to the topic today. I think one, we try to help higher education institutions understand, and the whole system of higher ed, understand that race-conscious policy is necessary because higher ed has been a historically racist system, as well as the other systems that impact it. Racism isn't something that happens over there that has a after effect on higher ed. That higher ed itself has been positioned in ways that have excluded Black students, for example, or underfunded the colleges willing to provide opportunity to Black students. And these are facts, these are not opinions, right? These have been demonstrated in court cases, and unfortunately, analyses show they continue until today in terms of some of these practices. And I say that because it helps make the case for why is it the responsibility for higher education and higher education policymakers to address some of these issues with race in mind and eliminating racial disparities. Also, just another kind of key takeaway in this work is demonstrating that addressing other issues like income matters, but it certainly isn't the same thing as addressing race. And addressing those issues alone without addressing race explicitly will not result in closing racial equity gaps. Race and income are not the same thing. In fact, when you look at students from similar incomes, but from different racial groups, there are vast differences in their likelihood of completing college, and most importantly, their ability to manage their debt and repay their loans. So even among upper and income Black students, they still struggle to repay their loans. In fact, 1 in 3 of Black students from the highest income families and one analysis that we had done, again, default on their student loans, which is the worst case scenario in terms of having a negative impact on their credit. And so again, for those reasons, when it comes to a conversation around, well, what do you do about the Black student debt crisis, the policy solutions on the table have to keep race in mind and has to actually provide relief for struggling Black borrowers. And again, a strict income cap, for example, alone does not solve that problem. Understanding that Black people across the income spectrum continue to struggle with their debt, in part because of some of the issues Ashley already raised related to the legacy of slavery and discrimination in this country. And so I look forward to the conversation today, and happy to continue talking about the ways in which policymakers can advance solutions that with eliminating gaps for Black students in mind.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you for specifically highlighting the fact that wealth and income are not the same. I think too often in this conversation, and policymakers forget that. And when we remember that Black people have 1/10 of the wealth, as Black families have 1/10 of the wealth as white families, that point becomes even more salient and important for everyone to remember. And when we think about how people are able or not able to build wealth. So now I want to turn it over to Dr. Dominique Baker, Assistant Professor of Education Policy at Southern Methodist University, for her opening remarks.
Thank y'all so much for having me. Yeah, so I'm just going to keep building off of a bit of what Ashley and Tiffany have already shared, which is thinking about sort of our research base. What do we know, broadly speaking, about Black students, their reliance on student loans and sort of higher education? And so consistently, what we see is that Black students rely on student loans to finance going to college at higher rates than their peers, and that they struggle the most in repayment. This is something that Tiffany was mentioning around default, the fact that we see across income spectrums and whether or not students complete or don't complete, that Black students struggle the most when it comes to repaying their student loans. And this ties in a bit with what Ashley was talking about, that we have these larger structural forces that are sort of butting up against higher education. So as an example, labor market discrimination is a thing that exists. And when that intersects with who earns degrees, it happens that even though Black students earn a bachelor's degree, as an example, they can still struggle more to repay than other students who don't earn a bachelor's degree. And that's because of things like labor market discrimination, as well as we've got strong research that shows that in general, but in particular in times of recessions, Black students are sort of pushed to sort of upskill. So the idea being that if Black individuals can get additional credentials, they can get a graduate degree, they can get more certificates, it'll make them more competitive in tight labor markets. But what that often means is that those Black individuals take out more graduate debt than their peers in order to complete that upskilling, but then don't necessarily get rewarded for that in the labor market. So all of these pieces keep pushing that we have larger structural forces that create an environment where for Black students to get some prosperity, to feel that they can have some financial security in their life. Because we always have to remember, right, we in the United States create a world where a job means healthcare, it means retirement funding, it means a lot of different types of security, not just a paycheck. And that's particularly important right in things like a pandemic. So if we think that all of those things are there, then we create an environment where Black students, in order to try to get towards that, have to go towards college and then have to take out additional student loan debt. So all of these pieces are tied together fairly strongly. And the final piece I just wanted to make that I think can sometimes be overlooked is that often when we're talking about Black student loan debt, we are talking broadly, but we're also specifically talking about Black women. And that matters a lot because, as one example, when I did some research looking at who struggles with their burden around debt in the state of Texas, I saw that sort of consistently women were struggling more with their debt compared to men. But when I separated that and explored it a little bit further, that was overwhelmingly Black women who were struggling more. That was driving the findings I found for women overall. And so it's important that we also think about the sort of gendered nature of higher education, the gendered nature of who relies on student loans, because that also then impacts with the labor market and how we think about women and care for not just children, but care for other family members as well, and how that all combines into an over-reliance on student loans and sort of almost the denial of the ability to pay them back.
Thank you, Dominique. Definitely can relate to and everything you talked about, and remembering that, 2/3 of the outstanding 1.6 trillion is held by women. When we think about that, again, going back to the fact that Black borrowers are more likely to borrow and to borrow more, then it makes sense when we can drill down and know that it's really Black women who are struggling the most. And also coupled with the discrimination that they're facing, not just for being Black in the labor market, but also for being women. When we think about the gender pay gap on top of the racial pay gap, and those things combine to make it that much harder for Black women to make it in this market and to achieve the financial security you're talking about. So also want to turn it over to Ben Miller, Vice President of Postsecondary Education at the Center for American Progress. Share your opening remarks.
Thanks so much, Ashley, and thanks for having me here today. So we here at the Center for American Progress have been using federal data over the last several years to shed additional light on what the student loan crisis looks like for Black borrowers. And when we've done this work, probably the most common either question or pushback we've gotten from individuals has been something to the effect of, well, how do you know that this is really a story about race rather than about income or completion status or some of the things that have already been mentioned as not really fully explaining it. And that's why I think in many ways, two of the most illuminating statistics that we've uncovered in our work are really about how much the struggles for Black borrowers who have a bachelor's degree still persist. So we see that a Black borrower with a bachelor's degree still has a default rate that approaches 25%, which is about 4 times higher than what we see for a white peer with a bachelor's degree. Similarly, a Black borrower who completes a bachelor's degree on average actually owes 114% of what they originally borrowed 12 years after entering college, while a white borrower with a bachelor's degree owes less than half of what they originally borrowed. And the reason why I think these things matter is because they're showing us that the best situated borrowers from a repayment standpoint, those who in general have the lowest default rates, the highest repayment rates, things like that, are still struggling if they're Black. And if it's that concerning for those who have a bachelor's degree, we should be even more worried about those who say haven't finished college or things like that. But it is clear that there are differences here where education is not fully insulating a Black borrower from distress and troubles here the way it might be for, say, a white borrower. And I also think that matters in the policy debate and discussion because, you know, one of the things that I think has rightfully taken some hold in discussing overall solutions to student loans is the notion that low balance borrowers who didn't finish college or only under certificate are among some of the ones we have to worry about the most. They make up more than half of defaulters and things like that. But if you put a racial lens on that challenge, I think what you clearly see is that just addressing low balance non-completers does not fully address the Black student debt crisis. And that means that you need to be thinking about solutions that deal with higher amounts of debt and also acknowledge that people can still finish college and have struggles here. I also just want to make a couple other somewhat related points quickly. So one is, you know, I've focused a fair amount on default, what I've been talking about, but I also think we need to be really worried about debt pay down. You know, a borrower who doesn't default but still is not able to make meaningful progress retiring their debt is going to face a lot of struggles, whether that's limitations in ability to build wealth because you're still making a loan payment, psychological effects of the debt hanging over your head, especially one that's growing, or other things. We sort of can't stop our solution set at just preventing default. Third, you know, there's a fair amount of concern about private for-profit colleges in particular, and we should definitely be worried about them. In particular, a student who starts at a for-profit and does not, sorry, a Black student who starts at a for-profit, borrows and does not finish, has a 75% default rate, which is absolutely abysmal. However, the problems we see with Black borrowers and student loan debt are pervasive across all of higher education. And so it's important that we start with, but not finish at private for-profit colleges as we think about perhaps solutions at specific types of colleges. I also just say one of the real struggles we have here is the data we have are fairly old and not refreshed that regularly. So almost all the statistics I've been talking about here are for borrowers who first entered college in 2003, 2004, tracked through to 2015. We have some slightly newer data on those who entered in 2011, 12, but it doesn't really get updated very frequently. And we don't have anything at the individual institution level. And the other challenge is because it's survey data, when you want to start to unpack some of these questions about, say, the intersection of race and gender with perhaps completion status or program of study or other variables, you very quickly run into sample size problems where you kind of can't actually see what the data are telling you. And so I really think that the Department of Education in particular needs to find a way to be collecting more data on the racial or ethnic background of student loan borrowers at an individual level so that we can get a better picture of what this looks like more regularly and more granularly. And then finally, I'll just close with the point others are making that, you know, it's very clear that the problems driving these numbers do not exist solely within higher education. There are obviously very worrisome societal issues here that have to be addressed. But I think that's why it's crucial for us to think about making sure that higher education does not further exacerbate what happens in society. And that has to mean both dealing with existing Black borrowers, but also recognizing that we have to tackle future affordability as well. Because if we only address existing debt and don't do anything about those who are going to be going to college in the future, we are not going to sort of have longer term solutions here. So with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to discussing further.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, everyone. I think the overarching theme that everyone is touching on is really how pervasive and systemic these problems really are, and how there is not just one solution because we've allowed this problem to get so big. And now we're at a point where there are so many stakeholders who have a vested interest in what happens to this system, from the predatory for-profit colleges that are disproportionately targeting people of color, Black borrowers, veterans, single mothers, to the loan servicers who are involved with making sure people can navigate repayment. So there's just so many different, to the institutions, to the borrowers, to the Department of Education, so many people who have a vested interest and stake in what happens with this program. And so centering Black borrowers and centering solutions that address as many issues as possible and really thinking about a comprehensive approach is really important. But Ben, one thing you mentioned was the lack of data, and I think that's really key. And I think all of us support better data collection and transparency at the Department of Education level. But one thing that EdTrust is doing right now is trying to supplement this lack of data by doing some excellent research work and study work about Black student debt crisis, the Black student debt crisis, by actually talking to Black borrowers and really trying to not just use the numbers, but also tell the story. And so I'll let Tiffany share a little bit more about their Black student debt study. And also just, EdTrust has even before, this work will be really helpful on the Hill, where EdTrust has been an extremely great advocate for borrowers and for equitable policies and outcomes. And just how you see the conversation around student debt and higher ed changing on the Hill, and how you see your work further moving that conversation.
Sure. So just to start off with the study, Ben's absolutely right. There's not enough data, but also remembering that numbers tell just one part of the story. And so some of these questions around what is the experience like for borrowers? We can make some guesses around why folks are ending up in default because of the lack of wealth that's already been discussed. But what's that experience like? What's that decision-making process like? So we decided it was important to talk to Black borrowers themselves to hear their stories. We started this national study. If you want to learn more or even participate, you can go to edtrust.org/Black student debt. And this is a study we're doing in partnership, University of Pennsylvania, working with Dr. Julio Bishop there. And we have a survey, and we also have interviews that we've been conducting over the last few months. And so again, our goal is to finish up data collection this year and be able to share more of our findings. But just want to highlight a couple of things that we're learning so far. I think one, there's this narrative that education about how the financial aid system and loans work will solve this problem. And the borrowers we're talking to understand that what a loan is. They know that they're borrowing money. They know they have to repay it. And this almost insulted by this idea that they need to make better choices when they're like, am I not supposed to get a job to take care of myself, right? I've been left with no other choices. I'm supposed to go to college so I can get a job. There's no other money to pay for college, so I'm going to borrow this money. So yes, it's causing stress. Yes, it's hard to repay. And I have negative feelings about that. However, I had no other choice. So it kind of debunked some of the, again, existing narratives that students didn't know what they were getting into. And there are aspects of the process that they did not understand until they were in it. But the bigger idea of I was taking out a loan and assuming they had any other choice but to borrow that money for college, for their necessities, is very frustrating, right, for them. And so I just wanted to point that out as well. And the other kind of thing I would highlight that's coming up so much is just the level of distress. So of course, there are economic decisions that having loans are impacting, like purchasing a home or a car or what job to take. And those things matter because they are, of course, helping to shape a life experience and quality of life. But I think there's the social emotional side of things, and folks talking about kind of the weight of even walking into the financial aid office, the kind of apprehension and anxiety they have about even checking their balance online, to the point where, in one of the most extreme examples, a borrower talking about, having a wellness check called by one of the servicers because of where the conversation went, because she was exploring options related, well, what happens if I'm not here? Do I still have to pay? Does my family have to pay, right? And so the servicer was concerned about her well-being and did a wellness check, and she said, actually, my life wasn't necessarily in danger. I wasn't interested in ending my life. I really wanted to understand how this could end, though, in terms of this relationship with the loans. And it's interesting that they understand that it's causing this type of distress, and yet there's still nothing they could even do to change my payment, right? Like level. So anyway, it's just one of the great examples of how borrowers are being impacted as well. And kind of finally, we were very curious in the beginning. We're like, what's happening in the lives of Black people that are directly connecting to their ability to repay? And one of the other things that we're learning is there's regular life things that happen, like the loss of a family member, someone gets sick, you might lose a job. This could happen to anyone. You can graduate and it might take you longer than you thought to find a job. However, with the lack of a safety net, those types of events can send folks into like economic peril, where they are choosing between housing and student loans, or some of these decisions where they went from being able to manage their debt to not. It was not that there were life experiences that don't happen to anyone but Black people, but that when they happen to Black people don't have a safety net because they don't have wealth, right? Or and so it could create a lot of economic distress for them and their families, and also them being the ones with perhaps college degrees, they were also an economic resource for other members of the family. So they don't themselves have the cushion needed to absorb some of these like life experiences that can happen. So those are just some of the early themes. We're excited to share more in the upcoming year. And I think what we're seeing in some of the policy conversations is an acceptance that there is a unique crisis happening among Black borrowers in particular. So at least some consideration as proposals are put on the table around, let's say, debt cancellation, there's consideration of, well, how would that impact Black borrowers in particular? There's examples of, more than a year ago, a group of senators putting out a call to the advocacy and research community saying, we're concerned about borrowers of color, what's going on, what do you all suggest, right? So we've seen examples from folks on the Hill showing interest in trying to integrate solutions that help. And I think another great example of at least there's some attention to student borrowers and the distress they're under. And the CARES Act, it's not perfect, but some relief was provided to some federal student loan borrowers, is another example that, in recognition that students are having difficulty repaying their loans, and it's going to be up to policymakers to figure out some of these solutions rather than saying, well, students shouldn't have borrowed in the first place, or some of the other kind of older narratives. This is all on them, but some acceptance that college is no longer affordable, but it's almost nearly required for them to participate in the economy. And students being saddled with debt is creating a crisis not only for them and their families, but the broader economy as well.
Well, you just gave us so much great information. I think one of the things that's really important to remember that you touched on was financial literacy is only a solution if there is actual choice. And too often we want people to, and we just think because someone is struggling financially, they must not be managing their money properly. When really it's the people with the least amount of money who manage their money the best, who know exactly where their money is going, because they have to know, they have to make decisions. They don't have the luxury of not reading things carefully, of not planning things out. They actually know very well what's going on with their funds. So I think, at CRL, we work across the financial services spectrum, and that's something we constantly have come up against is, why isn't financial literacy the answer? And you're so right that it's not, when there is no real meaningful choice. There's no other option. If you have to go to college, but you can't afford it, and the only options being available to you are loans, then you have to take out loans if you have to go to college and you have to get a job. So really appreciate that, and really excited for the study and the work that you are doing when that comes out, and know it will definitely continue to move the work forward. And also want to ask Dominique, so Tiffany mentioned the CARES Act and the fact that student debt is definitely part of the conversation when we think about how we get people through this crisis. And when we start thinking about recovery, it also has to be part of that conversation as well, right? Because it is a drain, not just on individuals, but the economy. But one piece of that is state investment in higher education. And that's really top of people's mind as to what's going to happen when we know that state budgets are suffering. And we saw this after the Great Recession, where there's a $10 billion hole since the Great Recession in state budgets for higher ed, most of which has not been recovered. And this is only going to get worse. So this has led to, more interest in this idea of a state-federal partnership for higher ed funding. We are well overdue for a Higher Education Act reauthorization, but that has been on the table for many of these conversations and proposals. And so how could a state-federal partnership be designed to provide specific support for Black students who are too often attending institutions that have never been well-funded or well-resourced, like historically Black colleges and universities who are doing the lion's share of educating Black students and doing it affordably and in an equality way?
Yeah, that's right. There's like so much in there.
I want you to give us everything.
Yeah, I know, right? So no, but I think
everything.
But right, like it's so because it's this interesting dynamic where when we think about how do we help people with student loans, we often have to think about it almost in two ways. One is people accumulating loans, and then the other is helping people navigate repayment of loans. And I say that because often the solutions are slightly different for each one. So Tiffany has mentioned, right, that there are conversations that are happening at the federal level about the potential around the cancellation of debt, right? But a thing to keep in mind is you could cancel all debt that is currently held. That actually doesn't stop people from taking on more. So when we think about solutions, we often have to think sort of from two perspectives around what are we doing to make sure that college is affordable, whatever affordable means, and then how we help students to navigate repayment. So I often think about state-federal partnerships on the front end a bit, thinking about how can we make higher education be as affordable as possible for students. And so there are a number of potential proposals that are out there. One of the things that I particularly resonate with is there's research from a professor at Harvard that looks at if we put more money into schools and into institutions, and we focused it on reducing the tuition dollars, or if we put more money into institutions and we focused it on sort of instructional dollars, what payoff would we see for students? And they generally found that the sort of bigger bang for your buck is really when you funnel money into the actual educational enterprise. And that there's a potential that if you did something like that, provided funding to institutions that was targeted toward that, teaching in the broadest frame, that there would be ways that you could sort of help students to navigate the process easier, to have a better learning experience, and then be more likely to graduate and move on from there. And so a potential policy measure that could be in place for a state-federal partnership is around the idea that you could say that students will have tuition-free or potentially debt-free chances to enroll in higher education. And with that, the requirement is that the money that comes in from the federal government has to go to instructional spending. So this is a 2-for-1 special that would hopefully make college more affordable because you could reduce the amount of reliance on student loans for students. And then it would also make it more likely that that money is going into actually helping with instruction. and helping to make sure that students graduate in a timely manner. So like overall, that makes a lot of sense. But I think that there is room to explicitly think about which institutions are serving Black students. I think there's also room to think about which institutions explicitly serve Latinx students, Native students, right? Like, there are a number of student groups for whom higher education does not always think of when they are trying to structure their supports and resources. And so I think that, and this is a thing that I once wrote in a piece for the Education Trust, but I think that there are ways that we could create a partnership where the federal government said a certain amount of money needs to go towards instructional spending. And with that, we will give you enough money, state, to make sure that we reduce costs and make it more affordable for students to go, but we will give you additional funds if you are serving Black students, if you are serving Native students, in ways that can actually sort of create more of a balance in funding. Because, right, we see this a lot with K-12 districts, that different schools are funded at different rates, and often these go along racial lines. And so this is a way that the federal government could step in, of course, with the understanding that states have to also, chip in their part as well. That's, the part of a federal-state partnership. Otherwise, it's just the federal government giving money, which is the thing they could do. If there's nothing else that we've seen over the past year, we make choices with how we spend federal dollars. And so there are many different ways that this could be approached. But by creating a partnership, it makes it more likely that states, quote unquote, have skin in the game, which people like to see in DC. So as an overall solution, I think that there are ways that we could definitely explore when thinking about how do we make college more affordable for students on the front end, in addition to thinking about the ways that could happen on the back end that make states be an integral player.
Thank you, Dominique. I think that was all really helpful and insightful. I really liked the study you did about what happens when you try these different pathways for the dollars. That was really interesting. And I think the thing you mentioned about how we're seeing the K-12 inequities, that's the same at the higher ed level as well, right? We were just talking about HBCUs. When we look at the inequities in state funding, if we look just at state funding for public HBCUs versus public historically white colleges, how they have never been funded. There are even lawsuits pending to this day to try to get some of that funding back, and still that has not occurred. And that's before we even get to the federal underfunding, right? So I think that's really important, and definitely appreciate everything you're saying about how we think about this at the front end. And going back to also the other end of the system, the back end, Ben, hoping you can talk to us a little bit more about, one of the things that many of our organizations talk about is how we improve repayment, how we fix income-driven repayment, which is overly complicated. We would argue not actually affordable, doesn't always help borrowers. And so how can we improve income-driven repayment, and why aren't they more effective at meeting the needs of Black student loan borrowers as they currently are structured?
Yeah, so thank you. I think this is really a key question because, the only implemented policy solution really dealing with student loans over the last decade has been creating these income-based repayment plans. So for those of you who aren't familiar with them, essentially what they are is a set of options that tie borrowers' monthly payments to their income. Usually it's about 10% of what we call discretionary income. So we exempt an amount equal to 150% of the poverty level based upon your family size. You owe 10% of that remaining amount, and then you get loan forgiveness after 20 or 25 years, depending upon your plan. The details vary a little bit. And, I think the real challenge here is we don't have a great feel for how well these plans are working in solving, or rather, we don't have a great feel of exactly which challenges these plans are solving. So I want to be clear, I think they are absolutely better than nothing. We wrote a piece looking at more recent loan borrowers, those who entered in 2011-12, and what was happening 6 years later. And there was some confusion where it made it sound like income-driven repayment was harming them. That's not the case so much as the question is it really solving all of our problems? And let me sort of talk about what we're seeing and what we're not seeing and why we should be potentially worrying one or the other. So one thing that stood out was, those 2003, 2004 borrowers I was talking about earlier, we didn't have income-based repayment really until 2008. So potentially maybe in a world with income-based repayment, some of those defaults we saw wouldn't have happened. We'd expect maybe default rates would go down or something like that. Well, those 2011-12 borrowers had income-based repayment the whole time, but we're still seeing defaults looking like they're going on about the same pace for Black borrowers. So this suggests sort of one of two things. One could be that the default rates would be even worse for the 2011-12 entrants than for the 03-04 entrants without income-based repayment, in which case it's sort of averting an unseen set of even worse outcomes. Or what it's doing is sort of maybe helping borrowers with one set of problems that is not quite the same as what might be driving borrowers into default. There's no way the data cannot tell us like which of these things is true, because we can't go back in time and run an experiment and give income-based repayment to those other folks and things like that. But a few things do stand out. So, one is that income-based repayment is a monthly solution. Essentially, it drops your monthly payment. But what we really see is that a loan is both a monthly problem and a multi-year problem. Because, if we put someone on income-based repayment, we solve their monthly problem, interest keeps accumulating. And so you can get borrowers who have paid month after month, year after year, and owe more than they originally borrowed. And that, I think, is a massive psychological hit to people. This feeling of treading water, not making any progress, things like that. It also means that they're potentially setting themselves up for a big tax bill if and when their loans get forgiven, because currently that 20-year loan forgiveness is going to be taxed. So you could have a big hit at the end for borrowers. So that may be scaring some people off. The second thing is we really see that in particular, low balance borrowers aren't using it. So one of the things that was striking is we actually saw that Black borrowers with a bachelor's degree, about a third of them were using income-based repayment, compared to only about 20% for those with an associate degree, at lower rates for those who had either a certificate or hadn't finished. And that's suggesting that, the prospect for someone who maybe only goes to college for a semester or a year, and we say to them, don't worry, we'll tie your payments to your income, you won't pay for more than 20 years. If I only did a year of college, that sounds like an awful deal. Why am I going to potentially have interest accumulate and all of that and not have it fully solve my problem? And so, I really think as we think about income-based repayment, we really need to think about kind of like three key solutions here. I think one is we need to find some way to tackle the interest accumulation, because it really, I think, is just a killer for people. If they have massive balances that are growing, it's going to undercut the goals of the program. Two, I really think we have to have more interim amounts of forgiveness. If you only borrowed for a year or two of college, if you only owe like $10,000 or something, making you wait 20 years to get rid of all of it, it's just too long. And we need to give people sort of faster paths out of income-based repayment. And the third thing I'll say is, I think that we should think about how within the loan program, we have some borrowers where, the odds were they were probably going to have to borrow to finance the thing because it was expensive. And we've got some who are borrowing because essentially the system has let them down with insufficient affordability. So either they're borrowing way more than a rational system should make them do, or they're, say, like a maximum Pell recipient who we never should have forced into loans in the first place. And it is probably worth at the very least making some differentiation there and saying some of these loans we've forced people into, it is not worth the time and money to chase them on this, and we should just get rid of them. I think that can go or that can then be followed by a broader discussion about debt cancellation, things like that. But like just as a starting point, trying to force some people into an income-based repayment system is kind of complicated when we let them down and force them into debt in the first place. It's really not doing anybody any favors. They're going to slip through the cracks. It's going to be very expensive to try and help them. And it's just ultimately, I think, not actually worth it on like a cost benefit standpoint.
Thanks, Ben. Well, and since you brought it up, debt cancellation, I think it's always important to talk about that specifically. And so, and then we're going to get to some of the audience questions. But debt cancellation has been increasingly a part of the national conversation. Really, I think all of us have seen the momentum around it over the past year has just been incredible in terms of who's talking about it and when, and like who is part of the conversation. And you know, CRL has done research, EdTrust has done research, everyone, most people here have done research about what the levels of impact, and we showed, you know, we did a paper with civil rights partners last year where we showed even if you did $10,000 across the board, you would have an incredible impact, because it was mentioned, as it was mentioned earlier, so many people who are struggling the most are struggling on really small amounts, less than $10,000, and they're former Pell students, they're low-income students. But even at that low level, which at this point, given where we are, with the COVID crisis, the economic recession, and all these other pieces would not be enough, but we can have an amazing impact at different levels of cancellation. And so wondering, and other folks can jump in, but Tiffany, maybe you in particular could talk about your vision or thoughts on debt cancellation and how it would impact Black borrowers in particular.
Yeah, just two quick things. Do want to leave enough time for Q&A, so I'll try to be fast. And just say, one, when it comes to why debt cancellation, because it is something that is complicated, and there are equity advocates who feel like it's regressive because you'll cancel debt for a lot of people who could otherwise pay, using tax dollars that, you know, from students and from families who, you know, didn't have the opportunity to go to college. And so that's not the right thing to do from an equity perspective. And others, for arguments we've already been making, there are groups of folks within the budget who need their debt canceled pretty much in order to be able to move forward. And so I think a couple of ideas that have helped us think through why canceling at least some amount of debt is an equity issue is, one, this idea that the research suggests this isn't that students were irresponsible and were just over borrowing for things that had nothing to do with education or their well-being. This is a dysfunction of the higher education system, and student loans increasing and student loan debt increasing is in response to students addressing the cost of attending college and their available resources to pay. Also, the kind of other reason of why this matters so much is the increasing importance of a higher education opportunity in terms of your economic participation. Nearly all of the new jobs created since the last recession require some sort of post-secondary degree or credential, for example. And then now those are the types of jobs that also give you access to the things that impact your well-being, like healthcare, retirement benefits, et cetera. So now we're talking about not a nice to have, not, oh, college isn't for everyone, but more so everyone has the right to decide what's right for them. But anyone who wants to go to college, it should be affordable, considering all of the other things that we're making college a requirement for. And so for those reasons, we were like, no, this is definitely an equity issue, but understand that there might be different vehicles for getting there. So kind of final thing I'll say on it is, I do think it is an issue that will require more momentum and support and direction from the communities most impacted. And so we haven't talked about, there's a lot of really great research out there, but it's important to be connected with the communities most impacted by these issues. So NAACP, for example, right now, the Youth and College Division, as we speak, is on Twitter doing a tweet storm about Black student debt, right? If you're interested, you can follow them. Their hashtag is Black student debt. They're also using hashtag NAACP. Again, that's the NAACP Youth and College Division. They just put out a great piece earlier this week talking about the importance of addressing the Black student debt issue. As an example of why it's so important, it's going to take partnership with students, with civil rights advocates, and a data point is not going to get us to the finish line on something like that issue, where so much more momentum will be needed in order to gather the types of support that will be needed to get something like debt cancellation passed.
I forgot to schedule my tweets, Tiffany, but thank you for that. We're gonna jump into some of the audience questions now, unless Ben or Dominique want to add anything right now. Okay, so one question we have is, what would you recommend should change in state policy to stop disadvantaging Black borrowers? Specifically thinking about examples where state financial aid is geared toward full-time students, where Black students are disproportionately represented among part-time. or that disqualify individuals with a criminal record, when we know that Black bars are also disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system and over-policing, like the Tennessee Promise. So does anyone want to give any thoughts on that?
Do you want to start? I'll just go very fast. I mean, I think obviously the things suggested by that questioner in terms of state financial aid policy and making sure that it doesn't shut out students by sort of adopting a mentality of a more traditional student body, so like full-time, straight out of high school, all of that is really important. But I think the other thing that really can't be forgotten here is differential levels of state support for different types of colleges. So for example, we know that a lot of states kick a lot more money to their flagship institutions that tend to be less diverse than, say, regional four-year colleges or community colleges. And so I think it's really important to think about sort of resource equity between institutions. And that gets at some of the things that Dominique was talking about earlier too, about trying to increase support for operating expenses to help with that. Because the other thing, we did a paper not that long ago that was showing that there is a very substantial revenue gap between just four-year and two-year colleges. And part of what also drives that revenue gap is not only do the four-year colleges get more money, they can also charge more tuition money because they're enrolling, at least the flagships, like enrolling a wealthier student body. And so you need to really think about support that recognizes, A, we want to more equalize how much operating support there is, and also B, recognize that certain institutions cannot charge as much in tuition as others and need to make up that tuition revenue difference too through state support.
Yeah, and just adding on to this, actually, I, along with some other researchers, are currently doing work looking at state funding of colleges and state funding through financial aid over the past basically 20 years to try to see what we can think about for the pandemic. And one of the biggest things that we actually found is that from like, I think, yes, I do definitely have it on my second screen. From 1998 until 2018, there's been over a 10 percentage point drop in the share of state financial aid that goes based on need versus based on merit. And so one of the pieces here that I think would be incredibly critical is that as we think about Black students in general, but in particular in light of the pandemic, is that states have to find ways to funnel their money. I understand that resources are scarce, but the money that they do have available for state financial aid has to be put out through need, looking at students' income or looking at how much it's expected that their family can contribute to paying for college, instead of looking at GPAs or test scores, because we have research that shows that when we start to rely more on merit-based aid, Black students often are not getting awards, or if they do get them, they're getting the smallest amount.
And I would just add really quickly, the other kind of policies we've been taking a look at are free college policies. We have a new report coming out tomorrow. And just to reinforce what was asked from the question around those types of requirements and how Black students might be disproportionately impacted, we found that about half of existing statewide free college programs do have restrictions that prevent students who are impacted by the criminal legal system from being able to participate in those programs. A number of them also do limit their participation of full-time students, which can also have an impact on disproportionate impact on Black students as well as limiting. Most of the programs are still limited to two-year institutions. And again, if you are a student wanting to attend a four-year college or university, a Black student, a lot of times these statewide programs don't provide any additional aid.
That was all really helpful. Dominique, you mentioned the merit-based aid. I think that's particularly important when we think about how it reproduces inequity, right? Like if the K-12 system is already inequitable and underfunded, and we already know who is succeeding in that system and who is designed and how it's designed, then when we then privilege those who got the best out of that system with our state aid, then we're just reproducing and compounding the problem. So I think I loved all of these comments. They were all really helpful. We only have a few minutes left, but we got some really good questions in the chat, and we will all share our contact information afterwards. I'm sure people will follow up. So actually, I think what we'll do is, if anyone has, I'll give everyone 30 seconds. There was something you didn't get to cover that you really want to say, take 30 seconds and do it. Start with Dominique.
This is how I learned Ashley doesn't like me. Okay. I can do this. No, I think what I will sort of say is like, this is an incredibly complex issue. The more you try to read about it, the more you try to learn about, well, what's that one silver bullet? What's the one solution that does this or does that? You learn that like, oh, okay, well, this gets complicated by that or these types of things. And so I guess I think that we have to be committed to trying to deeply understand the issue because that's how we craft appropriate solutions. That's why I'm so excited that Tiffany is doing the work that she's doing through EdTrust. There are other groups that are trying to find ways to also dig a little bit deeper so that we can better understand as much as possible. A great example is that part of my dissertation, when I did interviews with recent graduates from an HBCU and talking to them through navigating their debt, a thing that kept coming up was their family's experience with payday loans and how that influenced their perceptions about their debt and what that was. But that wasn't a thing that we talked about that much in the research, right? And so this really echoes that part about trying to deeply understand this and working with communities instead of sort of studying communities is so important to trying to think about how you can craft responsive policy that actually gets you to the goals that you're hoping to achieve.
Thank you, Dominique. Ben?
Sure. I mean, I think one thing I would say is that I think part of the thing that individuals have to recognize here is that we're really talking about systemic level challenges, which is why I think the pushback on, this isn't about financial literacy, this isn't about just like shopping around is really important because, we see it in the data, the borrowing rate for Black students is very high. And it's not because, if your local college is unaffordable, if all the college options to you are unaffordable based on your family's income, you're gonna have to borrow. And so I think, I saw there were a bunch of questions in the chat asking about like strategies or things like that. And it obviously never hurts to look at scholarships and things like that. But I also think just be realistic that, individuals are going to have challenges changing the larger environment on some of these things. But that at the same time, it's important to not sort of assume that, you absolutely shouldn't borrow or shouldn't go to college. I mean, that those choices are just more complicated. And I do worry about sometimes that ping-ponging too far the other way to sort of say, oh, because I'm gonna have to borrow because the debt's too high, I definitely shouldn't go or shouldn't borrow or things like that. And I just think there are real challenges there. And because of the systemic problems we have, it's really hard to provide good advice here about what to do.
And Tiffany?
Yeah, and just building on what Ben said, tinkering around the edges will not solve this. So tinkering with interest rates or some things can be helpful, like streamlining. If there's 10 different repayment programs and they're all confusing, streamlining them into one or two can be helpful for clarity, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of a sudden, voila, Black students can now repay their loans, right? Like, so it's gonna have to take major solutions on the table, like state-fed partnerships Dominique mentioned, like debt cancellation, to make sure, you're handling debt right now, but then also that there's some sort of debt-free college so this crisis doesn't happen again in the future. And so again, I think it's going to take big and bold solutions and also partnership with the people closest to the issue, and make sure we're not talking about these issues in the abstract, but alongside the communities that are being most impacted.
And I'll just sum everybody up by saying we have a problem. It is systemic, but we are definitely able to fix it if we are serious about fixing it. Thank you so much. Thank you all of you for your excellent remarks and insight, and I will turn it back over to James.
Thanks so much, Ashley, and thanks so much to Tiffany, Ben, and Dominique. What a terrific panel and discussion. We so appreciate your insight, and we appreciate all of you who tuned in and joined us. Before we go, just a brief housekeeping note from our end about some upcoming Hunt Institute webinars. This Thursday evening at 7 p.m., we have a webinar that's the latest in our Race and Education series, and it's an all-student panel, which we're really excited about. Topic is student perspectives on the future of inclusion and equity in K-12 education systems. And I think my colleague should be dropping a link to register for that if you are interested in the chat. A week from today, we're going to have another webinar on our Supporting Innovation in Education series. This will be on early childhood philanthropy in the age of COVID-19. Please do remember that we also have a landing page with a number of COVID-19 resources that we hope will be helpful for policymakers at a variety of levels. That's it for us. Thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks again to our wonderful panelists and moderator, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks all.